Professor Stephen Kent. Stephen is a professor of microbiology and immunology at the Doherty Institute of the University of Melbourne. He trained as an infectious diseases physician, immunologist and vaccine scientist in Melbourne and the US. He manages a large group of immunologists dedicated to understanding and improving immunity to pandemic viral pathogens such as SARS-CoV-2. He remains active in infectious diseases, clinical medicine, caring for people with infectious diseases and assisting in the clinical development of new vaccine and immunotherapy strategies. So welcome, Stephen. Thank you very much for joining us as well. Great to have you with us at this late hour, or early hour for you. Great. Hopefully Nawamin as well is going to be in the panel. I think he's about to be pinned onto the panel here as well. Fantastic. We're all gathered. So really just wanted to kind of there's a few questions I think that have come up across the board. One thing that we actually had a question sort of sent through even before we started, which I think is not something we've particularly addressed, is actually one from Leo Swaddling, which was, does reduced incidence of severe disease with Omicron breakthrough infections support the role of T cells in protection from disease or binding antibodies, or are low-level neutralizing antibodies enough? So just thinking about Omicron, how important, or what are the panelists' views on the differences there, particularly in thinking about T cell responses and also antibody responses in that context? Stephen, shall I kick off with you?
Right. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah. Look, Omicron's an interesting beast because it's so mutated, particularly from an antibody perspective, that when people get infection with Omicron, despite the vaccines, a lot of what they're making is a naive response. It's a bit more like N than S, if you like. And so that's actually a lot slower than the recall response. And yet it is a milder disease. And as you probably know as well, it's been well studied in animal models and in vitro, the tropism of Omicron. So it may be that the spike is so mutated that it's not as infectious in the lower respiratory tract. But no doubt, some cross-reactive memory to antibodies and a lot of cross-reactive memory to T cells is recalled. But it's very much, from an antibody's perspective, a naive response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Nawamin, what are your thoughts?
Well, we have a great pandemic of Omicron in Bangkok and as well across the countries, and a lot of healthcare workers actually got infected with this strain. Even though healthcare worker here has got vaccinated with 2 doses of AstraZeneca or another 2 doses of Pfizer vaccine or Moderna, so Omicron is real and is actually escaping the antibody response, also T cell responses. People say it's milder is probably because we got vaccinated, so it can't cause these severe diseases. And in Thailand, the hospital admissions and the use of respirators in the country is decreasing compared to the outbreak of Delta strain. So I think it's important. It's caused another outbreak in the country, but the question is this going to be the last one, or is it going to end this pandemic or not?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Marcus, maybe you can sort of add some context around, Paul was just mentioning at the end of his talk as well about this sort of slight dilemma about vaccine inequality. Not slight dilemma, big dilemma. But obviously in the patients that you're treating, it's a very different sort of situation. How does sort of Omicron and other sort of variants that are kind of popping up kind of are affecting in that situation?
Right. No, so it's a good question. I usually say like this when I get, asked by people in general, by media, is Omicron much milder? Is it a different disease? And I usually say still that it is SARS-CoV-2. It still can cause severe disease, and it can cause that in a lot of patients that we have seen in our hospitals as well. But there is one significant factor still that is different, and it is that if you are vaccinated, you are going to do better actually, in comparison to if you are naive. And this is actually, it's interesting because even if you only have 2 vaccine shots and literally have very low levels of neutralizing antibodies we can't measure, you still are going to do much better in comparison to individuals which are naive. And then you're going to do even better when you have 3 shots, which of course can be due to a combination maybe of antibodies, neutralizing antibodies, which are going to be higher. But it's still interesting, that feature that you still see even after 2 vaccine doses, that you do have this protective efficacy still by a vaccination. And whether that is non-neutralizing antibodies or something else, but nevertheless, there's some type of immune-mediated mechanism, a combination of them probably, that is playing in here that we might not fully understand, at least at this point, that might be beyond neutralizing antibodies only when it comes to protection from severe disease in Omicron. Those are my 2 cents about this question.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, just picking up on some of the data that you shared earlier with the solid organ transplant recipients and the breadth of responses that you saw there in those patients. I think you mentioned that clearly there are some individuals that are responding, but there are also quite a lot that just don't have any response. So again, in those contexts and also other immunocompromised individuals, what can be done there? You kind of talked about other therapies that obviously they can be potentially protected with, but what's the best solution?
Right. So there are 2 different things that we or people in general are trying to do. Is first of all is to give many of these patients also monoclonals. And the problem, of course, with Omicron, which has happened, is that some of them are not working. But the other part here, and this is something that we have seen and other people have seen, for example, in the solid organ transplant patients, are that you usually with time you decrease dosage of these drugs which are inhibiting your immune system. So if you give a 3rd or 4th shot, even as Paul was talking about as well, with a little bit delayed, it actually is, these responses are starting to come up in these individuals. And this is linked to donor center responses to a high degree as well. So there's no question about that as well. So that's partly, I think, what we or other people are trying to do more now, particularly at the clinics, are to spread out, so to say, the dosing a little bit more and try to time it a little bit better also with different type of treatments as much as we can. And that might, and that is at least improving their immune responses to some degree in these patients. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Paul, we've got a question from Wolfgang Leitner, who asks, at what point, for example, after how many boosters do you start to worry about A, T-cell exhaustion, and B, original antigenic sin by continuing to focus response to Wuhan epitope-specific T and B cells? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it'd be that in some of the cancer vaccine trials where these RNA vaccines have been given, they've given loads of doses, and the responses look pretty functional. So I think probably just the way the antigen is presented, the context, which has got, well, it's very interesting what the innate signaling context is, because, there was a recent publication from the Stanford group about what the difference between prime and boost. Everybody's kind of recognized with the RNA vaccines, you get a kind of secondary, the second dose gives you kind of much more significant side effects, and that's underpinned by a bigger day 1 response, which is obviously driven by your adaptive immunity that you've generated after the first one. So I think it's quite in that context, the vaccine is giving you a bit of antigen for a period of time with a reasonable amount of co-stimulation, and that's not the kind of situation which drives a lot of exhaustion. You probably need to distribute the antigen slightly differently and give it for much longer, a kind of higher level. So I think watch that space, but you might get kind of more limited responses to the vaccine, but I doubt you'd start to kind of tolerize. You can do that with very high doses of the adenos, but that you have to go to doses which we couldn't really achieve in the clinic. And original antigenic sin, well, that's quite an interesting question. If the thing has diverged a lot, but everybody's been vaccinated is already going to be somewhat kind of under that schema, because you've got memory responses and they're just easier to re-stimulate if they're partially cross-reactive than prime a new response. But so far so good, especially from the T cell side. But it's not impossible that you get some variant where it's not quite so helpful. There's sort of a lot of partial data about how that has impacted on the primary response, essentially, but those data are really gone. So all of us will have got both vaccinated, and pretty soon all of us have been infected, I would have thought, as well on top of that. So we'll have quite a broad memory pool to draw on. So yeah, it's a good question, and I think anybody who said that they could predict what was going to happen is kind of a little bit optimistic, because so far it hasn't been very predictable at all.
That's very true. Thank you. I mean, one thing again that I think Marcus brought up in his talk was the fact that these immunocompromised patients, you have a very, very long time. If there is going to be resolution, it just takes a long time for that to kind of occur in those individuals, and that's where a lot of these mutations could potentially be coming from. Obviously, there's a lot of people who have these primary and secondary immunodeficiencies, and then of course there's just those who haven't been vaccinated and have had natural infection, but then clear it quite quickly. What's the panel's opinion of where our priority should be in regards to? I mean, obviously, I think priority number one is for those who haven't been vaccinated to be vaccinated where they can. But is a sort of something that we should do more strategically to sort of focus our efforts on which kind of group of people really need to get that vaccine first? Because if immunodeficient patients, or maybe other groups that we haven't thought about, are where a lot of these VOCs are kind of popping up, is that something we need to worry about? Stephen, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of cases where prolonged infections have resulted in lots of mutations and neutralization escape. Exactly where the VOCs that end up dominating the world market come from is not clear to me, at least anyway. It may be those patients. It may be more stochastic and random events. Certainly, vaccination is a good stimulus to escape from, if you like. But I think what's sort of playing out, at least in my observation, is that the VOCs that are dominating are the ones that are the most transmissible. It's kind of interesting, the BA2 variant is perhaps, if anything, a little more neutralization sensitive than the BA1 variant, but it's actually more transmissible, so it ends up winning the race. So transmissibility, I think, is probably king in terms of the VOCs, perhaps slightly more important than the escape, at least at a sort of a global level. I guess that would be my thoughts. Thanks.
Marcus?
Well, no, but it's a good question. We kind of touched upon it before, and I personally, of course, agree that we should try to vaccinate people as much as we can that could get severe disease, which has been elderly patients in the Western world, could be immunocompromised individuals as well. But I am a forefront person when it really comes to global vaccination to a much better degree. And I think as long as we don't do that, these variants of concern are going to emerge when we least expect it, so to say. But it's a combination of it also. For example, if this is the case, as I pointed out with Omicron, that it has been emerging, for example, in HIV infected individuals that are untreated, then of course that's another dilemma there as well, because that means that these people need to get treatments as well. So it's not only about vaccine administration, it's about continuing to provide people in these countries also with the type of treatments that they need to not be in this immunocompromised states. So it's a combination, of course, of different things that is important still to keep in mind when it comes to the pandemic in general, more than only, I guess, distributing the vaccines as much as we can globally. But of course, that's what I think, at least, what we try to focus on as much as we can right now, and try to protect as much as we can, of course, the people which has not received the vaccine and has waning immunity as well in the Western societies, so to say.
Yeah. Thank you. And Paul, any sort of extra thoughts on that?
No, I don't think I've got much more to add. Everybody's sort of covered the ground pretty well. So yeah.
No worries. That's cool. Thank you. And Nawamin.
Well, I would add more detailed data from Eastern country. Then because of we know that the AstraZeneca vaccine and also Pfizer vaccine is very good at neutralizing Omicron, and the vaccine that we used in Thailand previously in the past few years is inactivated SARS-CoV-2, which is nothing wrong with that. But now when we have the more VOC that we need, especially mRNA vaccines. Our main vaccine in Thailand now is the AstraZeneca vaccines, and mRNA is a bit, how to say, it's a new platform. So Asian country, we quite conservative. So my parents or my grandma or my patient who's the age of over 60, which is, the vulnerable group, people who have the diseases, their underlying disease, they need a shot of mRNA, but they deny it because of they're quite conservative. So they think that having 2 doses of inactivated vaccine is enough for protecting them for the disease. And this is very challenging now because we have a lot of people who's elderly and have just 2 shots of inactivated vaccines from last year, and they need a booster. And it's quite challenging for us to promote a booster shot for this group of population, which is a group that would get very severe when they get infected with Omicron.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nawamin. We were going to wrap up there. Thank you so much indeed for all of our speakers, all of our panelists. We really, really appreciate your time, and thank you very much indeed.